Good. Good morning. Shabbat Shalom. And
Shabbat
welcome.
shalom.
Good. Welcome back to Valley Beth Shalom's Torah study. It's my joy to welcome my colleague and teacher and friend, Rabbi Marc Gellman, and to welcome all of you this Shabbat morning. I hope that the physical and social isolation of this last week has not ruined your spirit, but you have the strength to find your way through this week to Shabbat and to enjoy a nice quiet Shabbat with us. Please stay tuned after this Torah study, of course, about 10 o'clock this morning. Cantor Fox and I will be leading the Shabbat services, and those who'd like to say Kaddish, we will be saying Kaddish during that service. And take a look online at vbs.org. Click on the VBS at Home logo, and you'll find a listing of all the Valley Beth Shalom's programs and all the learning programs and preparation for Pesach that we're putting up. Excuse me. As well, you'll also find the social resources that we have. We have some wonderful opportunities for people to reach out and help one another during this crisis and to share love and support. Good morning, Rabbi Gellman. How are you today?
Good morning, Rabbi Feinstein. And let me also welcome members of my synagogue, Temple Beth Torah on Long Island, which is really the epicenter of this plague. And I want to welcome all of my congregants. And it's just a joy to have everybody together, even in this crazy sort of electronic bridge that links us all together. So I'm really happy, and it's great to see you. And it's good to connect in this way that, in a certain way, gives us a chance to go deeper than when we are together physically. Because when we're separated, you have to choose your words and choose your questions. And so let's begin with our study of the Haggadah. And what do you want to study first?
Well, last week we took up the sort of big, broad themes of the Haggadah. And last week we ended with your wonderful midrash on the four sons, the four children of the Haggadah. And in typical Gellman fashion, it gets turned upside down. The one that we all thought was the most meritorious turns out to be the most shallow. And the one who we thought was the least connected turns out to be the deepest. So let's continue in that vein. Let's begin the next section of the Haggadah, which is called Magid. Remember that the mitzvah of the Haggadah is the mitzvah V'higadata lebincha. You will tell your child in that day, because of what God did for me when God brought me out of the land of Egypt. That's the principal mitzvah, the principal motivation of the entire Haggadah. The Haggadah means the telling. And the Seder is just simply a dramatic form in which we get to tell the story. So now we get to the section of the telling of the story. And what the Haggadah does is it takes a section from the end of the book of Deuteronomy, from Parshat Ki Tavo, which was originally meant to be the declaration that a Jewish farmer would make when he or she brought their first fruits to the Holy Temple. And it's a 6-line summary of the experience of the Jewish people. We were in Egypt. We cried out to God out of our suffering. God brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and with miracles, brought us across the desert, planted us in this land, and gave us the bounty of this land. And then
the last step you've left out.
Which is?
Let's eat.
Yes, right, of course. It's a Jewish festival after all, right.
I mean, come on. What is the point of telling the story if there's no cake at the end?
There you go. Cake and tea, right.
Pesadika cake.
Pesadika cake. And then what the rabbis of the Talmud did was they took each and every verse of that particular section and they expanded it. So for each word, for each phrase, it was, and so we learned, and so it's said, and so it's written. And they brought us other verses from the book of Exodus and expansions upon that. And that was the way that the rabbis tell the story. Now, it's confounding to modern Jews because we don't tell stories that way. And we don't have the same agenda of stitching together the various sections of the Hebrew Bible to show that they're one unified narrative. So let's go back and tell the story ourselves. And I think one of the ways we can organize this is to think character by character. Okay. So let's begin, I think, with frankly, who is one of the more interesting characters in the story is Pharaoh. We're introduced to Pharaoh in the first chapter of Exodus. He's the new king who rules over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. He did not know the backstory. He did not know or want to know how he ended up with this large population of Jews. And he's worried, he's fearful. And he begins to promulgate this series of decrees which constitute genocide. First limited genocide, and then more general genocide against the Jewish population of the land. And then
let me say one thing about that.
Yeah.
This is the first problem with Pharaoh, and that is his motivation in killing Jews contradicts the motivation of a slave owner. It's like saying, if you raise cattle and you say, oh my God, I have too many cows, I got to kill a few cows. No one does that. The more cows you have, the richer you are. Same with slave owners. The more slaves you have, the richer you are. So why would he be motivated at all to kill Jews? It's a part of the story that doesn't fit with the motivation of a real slave owner. What do you think?
Well, because the motivation isn't slavery. The motivation is genocide.
Yeah, but why? They were wealth for him.
Because he's afraid of them. That's why. Because this is a policy promulgated out of fear. And policies promulgated out of fear are ineffective. I mean, the irony is, his phrase is, Hava nitchak malo. Let's be wise about this. And then he goes and does everything the opposite of what he should do.
Exactly. That's the point. Evil is always irrational and always overreaches. It was the same for Hitler. There was no reason to kill Jews. He really just wanted to take all the money of the Jews. And then he got convinced through his hatred, his irrational obsession. He got convinced that he had to exterminate the whole Jewish people. And in doing so, he diverted armaments and equipment that he needed to fight the Russians. And ultimately, people say that the Holocaust weakened the Reich and caused its defeat in the war.
Now, he's confronted by Moses, and each time the Torah says, at the first 5 times, it says he hardened his heart. And then the next 5 times, it says God hardened his heart.
Okay, so what sense do you make out of that? That's the most ethically problematic issue in the whole Haggadah.
Right.
Because if you harden somebody's heart by a force majeure, then they are not morally responsible for what they do.
So how do you understand that? My brother used to ask this question every year at the Seder, and it was cause for all sorts of wonderful arguments at the Seder.
Right.
Can you hold him morally responsible if an outside force forces him to act under duress?
Right. Well, that's why I asked you the question. So you can't ask me the question.
So my father, who you know, my father, who is a wise Jew,
I love.
My father's answer came directly from the experience that we were going through when we were kids. He said, look at Lyndon Johnson. Poor Lyndon Johnson knew already early, 1968, that the Vietnam War was a lost cause. And yet he couldn't end it. He couldn't end it for a number of reasons. One is because political leaders find themselves trapped by their own decisions. A series of policy decisions puts you into a circumstance where you then can't back out. Because if you back out, you lose face. If you back out, you lose authority. If you back out, it means admitting that the policy from the beginning was futile. And so what you end up doing is going further into the policy, even though it's clear to everyone that it's futile. And the second problem that my dad pointed out was that Lyndon Johnson was being fed information by whom? By his generals. And his generals only fed him optimistic information. And it took a very long time before Lyndon Johnson really began to understand that the information he was receiving was tainted. It was false. It was slanted. It wasn't real intelligence. It wasn't real information. And that's the cycle.
Connect that to Pharaoh now. How does that connect to Pharaoh?
Pharaoh is God. Pharaoh thinks of himself as God. Pharaoh presents himself as God. Pharaoh is the man who commands all authority, owns everything and everybody. So if a Pharaoh promulgates a policy, he can't turn himself around and say, "Oh, I made a mistake," or "Okay, I'll consider a different policy." There's not only a saving face, but there's a saving of his very omnipotence, his position, and his omniscience. He has to. It's the Pope in a certain way has the same problem. We rabbis don't have a problem. We're not infallible. Just ask our wives; they'll tell you, right? But
okay, so your solution is ultimately to say Pharaoh hardened his own heart through cognitive dissonance, through his obduracy, through his stubbornness, and through bad information.
Yes, and then what happens is once he does that again and again and again, then he's trapped. And the language of God hardened his heart is the language that describes the idea that he's beyond the capacity to change. Maimonides uses this idea. Maimonides says it's not that God changes him. It's simply that God removes from him his capacity to change. And I would suggest that's a more naturalistic way to think about it, that circumstances remove his capacity to change.
Okay, what do you say about our tradition's vengefulness about this, which is the mainstream interpretation of it, of the hardening of the heart, which is, yes, God hardened his heart. God did it. He was about to change. God prevented him from changing. God prevented him from letting the people go. Why? So that God could punish him for all of the years of oppression of the people. What do you think of that interpretation?
Well, look, then we get into the next character, who is God. And the character of God in the story is even more troubling than what you've articulated. I mean, the first problem with the character of God is, why did he let the Israelites languish in slavery for generation after generation after generation before God steps in to stop this travesty? And then the second problem is that when God chooses Moses and sends him, God's motivation isn't even to punish the Pharaoh, although that's one of the, I guess, beneficial side effects. The real motivation is that God wants to be glorified in the world. God wants to show off that he's God. Now, you understand from a religious point of view, you know this, from a theological point of view, there was a revolution going on here. Gods were local. And the God of Canaan, the God who meets Abraham in Canaan, doesn't have an office in Egypt, doesn't have power in Egypt. When in Rome, you daven like a Roman. Every God is local in his authority. There you go. And therefore, the question is, can the God of Canaan, the God of the Israelites of Canaan, show up in Egypt and affect history in Egypt? And the answer is, that's what the story is really about. The beginning of a notion of a universal God who applies a universal morality to the world is a theological revolution. But it's more than that.
Do you have a problem of God actually hardened his heart?
Yeah. The problem isn't the hardening of the heart. The problem is this idea that I'm going to be glorified by destroying this guy. And you get this image at the end of a punch-drunk boxer getting the life beaten out of him in the ring, and you keep waiting for the referee to call it a TKO and end the match, right? Because at the very end, at the last plagues, the 8th and the 9th and the 10th plague, you get a different picture of Pharaoh. When Pharaoh's officers come to him and they say, "We're lost, we're dead men," when Pharaoh's people are turning against him, that's when God has truly broken him. And that's when God says, now you'll understand that you're not the God of the universe, I am. I understand the motivation of the story, but it does present all these crazy moral problems.
Well, I don't know. I'm increasingly sympathetic. And I'm increasingly sympathetic to this very, very tough, but I think historically justified belief. And that is that when you fight radical evil, you must completely defeat them. You can't just get them to tap out, as they say in wrestling. You have to just crush them utterly. That it's what I would call the moral necessity of unconditional surrender. Lee had to unconditionally surrender at Appomattox. Hitler had to be dead. There had to be an unconditional surrender of the Japanese. And I have talked to many friends in Israel who say that the negotiations with the Palestinians, and I don't personally agree with this, but it's a challenging belief. They say it won't ever be resolved until we decisively and finally and completely defeat them militarily. What do you think about that? That radical evil requires a radical defeat.
Well, I wouldn't apply that to the Palestinians. I think that's a different circumstance.
Okay.
But the idea that radical evil demands a crushing defeat, because first of all, there's no compromise with it. There's no compromising with it. Is any compromise is going to allow it to exist in the world. The question still remains, though, if God could have destroyed the Pharaoh with the first plague, you didn't need 10 of them. The drama of the 10 plagues is not just the defeat of Pharaoh, it's the humiliation of Pharaoh. It's to try to remove from him every vestige of his authority and his power, and break the facade that protects him in front of his own people, in front of the world. That's what the 10 plagues are about.
Okay.
And it's the gods of Egypt who were destroyed as well, because each of the plagues actually has a resonance with Egyptian theologies. You begin with the Nile, the god of the Egyptians. The sun is blotted out by the plague of darkness, and finally the plague of the firstborn attacks even Pharaoh's own firstborn. You've destroyed the gods of Egypt as well.
Yeah, we can't get rid of all the moral questions, but I think at least we've raised them about the first character and the most important character, and that's Pharaoh. This radical.
Right. One more question. I want to understand his evil, and I want to present it the following way. One of my favorite movies in the world is The Ten Commandments.
Yeah,
the great Rabbi Cecil B. DeMille, his midrash on this story. Now, in casting Yul Brynner as Pharaoh, he makes a midrashic choice, right? Because it's a question of what is the quality of evil that Pharaoh represents. And Yul Brynner, no matter what part he's playing, is the king of Siam.
Yes.
Right? Anything, even in the Magnificent Seven, he's a cowboy, but he's still the king of Siam.
I completely agree. Rodgers and Hammerstein wrecked Yul Brynner's career.
And he never wears an undershirt. He always has that magnificent body, and that magnificent head, right?
No hair.
The first hottest bald man who ever lived.
That's right.
But Yul Brynner represents a certain kind of evil. It's an in-your-face evil. It's a self-confident evil. It's an evil that believes in his own divinity. And that's one kind of evil. But suppose we read Pharaoh differently. Now, interesting, the Prince of Egypt, which is the animated version, they had Ralph Fiennes play the voice of Pharaoh, and he plays it differently. He's a softer character, and he's a character filled with self-doubt. What if you play Pharaoh as a small man on a big throne? A small man who is filled with self-doubt and doesn't really believe he ought to be there, but is making all this noise in order to obstruct the fact that he's filled with all of this doubt, and that's a different kind of evil. It's a compensation.
Pharaoh as Napoleon.
Yeah, Danny DeVito. or Jack Nicholson. It's a different Pharaoh. A sort of think about some of those roles. By choosing an actor, you assign a certain quality of the character, a certain quality of the evil. So when you read Pharaoh, is he as self-confident as Yul Brynner? Is he as small as Danny DeVito? Is he as sneaky as Jack Nicholson? How do you read him?
I read him as Yul Brynner. I read him as a big, in-your-face, evil guy who completely has lost track of the difference between the gods and himself, that he thinks of himself as a god incarnate and therefore not really human, and that means whatever he says is the truth. And that to me is the fundamental break with the moral order. When you lose the capacity to see your own moral decisions as different from the truth. You have lost all shred of humility. You have lost all shred of introspection. And in the end, the only option for you is a life of complete self-absorbed psychotic evil.
So Yul Brynner is your Pharaoh. I'm thinking of the Danny DeVito character, actually, or the Ray Fiennes character.
Well, the other form of evil that you might put in is Eichmann, the sort of evil as the process man. So look, I'm just running a country here. I'm just running a country. I need order. I got a whole bunch of people who are going to stir up the pot. I have to keep order here. I have to keep the trains running on time. I have to but it's not really me. It's just the needs of the state. You could see it that way, but I think there's a real sense that the Torah wants to communicate with us that this is not fuzzy bunnies and birthday parties and hugs and smiles, that God is taking control of a creation that includes evil. Yotzer or uvore choshech oseh shalom uvore ra. Isaiah 45:7. I create light and darkness. I make peace and I make evil. I make evil. And the rabbis were so uncomfortable with Isaiah 45:7 that in the Siddur they changed it to uvore et hakol. They couldn't say vore ra, that he created evil. But God does create evil. And the greatest moral issue of the Haggadah is the greatest moral issue of life, which is how can a good, all-powerful God coexist in a world with evil? Not whether God hardened Pharaoh's heart, but why would God allow Pharaoh to inhabit a world where God is all good and all-powerful? It's the existence of Pharaoh that is the moral problem, and not whether his heart is hardened or not. And that requires a belief in a God it's a mature belief, Ed. It's not a childish belief. It's not a belief that only good comes from God. It's not a belief that only happiness comes from God. It's the belief that everything comes from God. Adonai Natan, Adonai Lakach. God gives and God takes. And our response to that is not to figure it out. That's the message of Job. That's beyond us. But Yehi Shem Adonai Mevorach. Your name is always blessed. It means all we can do is praise the God who is the God of everything. That to me is the lesson of the Pharaoh.
And I would read it a little bit differently. I think the other way to read it is in the Garden of Eden, man was given a choice. You could choose. The Kabbalah has a beautiful way of putting this. There were two trees, the tree of life and a tree of knowledge. The tree of knowledge is a tree of knowledge between. It's a separation. It's about individuation. It's about separating. It's analytic thought against synthetic thought. And you have a choice. And the problem of human being is that when you choose to put yourself in the position of God, and you choose to see yourself as separated and different from the other, and you refuse to take responsibility for the whole garden, as God asks you to, the natural consequence of that, as it escalates generation after generation, is Egypt, is a place of slavery and oppression, persecution, the breaking of human beings, the transformation of human beings into chattel, into property. And Pharaoh represents the ultimate consequence of the choice of individuation, the choice of selfishness over the choice of solidarity. And God says, I gave you this choice, and I'm not going to intervene. I'm not going to change your choice, but I'm going to jump into history at a certain point when I think it gets so egregious that you're about to completely destroy yourselves. And that's what this story represents. It's that moment.
Beautiful.
So we've cast Pharaoh. Now let's cast Moses.
Okay.
Now again, Rabbi Cecil B. DeMille chooses Charlton Heston, who of course is
the least Jewish-looking actor in Hollywood at the time.
Spartacus. No, he's not Spartacus. He's Michelangelo. Kirk Douglas is Spartacus.
Right.
Kirk Douglas would have made a good Moses, actually.
Yeah, I think so too.
But Heston is this powerful, masculine figure. I mean, that image of masculinity, even in the movie, by the way, women swoon before him, and Ann Baxter swoons before him.
Hey, don't think that was a mistake in casting. That movie was made at a time when the image of Jews was not Charlton Heston.
That's true.
It was weaklings and guys who weren't really athletic or strong physically. And so, in a way, the movie was an attempt to normalize Jewish existence in America.
That's a very nice way to see it. And what happens then is that, but you see, what happens is the Charlton Heston character has this, he just exudes strength. He just exudes power. But the Moses I read in the Bible is a man filled with doubt.
Yes.
He's always backtracking. I mean, at the burning bush, he argues with God again and again. Lo ish dvarim anochi. I'm not the guy to send. Send somebody else. I'll write you a check. Go. Don't force me to do this. And finally, even God gets exasperated and says, you're going to do this. And Moses, okay, I'll do this. But even then he comes back as soon as the people rebel against him and they say, why'd you make it harder on us? He runs back to God. He has this terrible learning disability. Whenever he is in a emotional confrontation, he melts. He loses his words. He falls on his face, is the language of the Torah. So let's take a look at Moses. Is Charlton Heston really the kind of strength that Moses exudes, or is there a different kind of strength? Is there a different? Is it a more nuanced strength, a more nuanced kind of character, a more familiar character that people like you and me and everyone else who isn't Moses can begin to say, yeah, I know what that's like. I know what that's like.
Well, I think ultimate leadership is a combination of humility and strength. You see it in Lincoln. This idea that the strongest person is the one who is most indifferent to everyone around him is wrong. I think that the greatest leaders are those who can hear the people and also who have enough internal resolve and courage, just simple courage, to pursue their vision and to lead the people. And for me, that's the combination that Moses had that was so brilliant, and why ultimately the rabbis were right in basically leaving Moses out of the Haggadah. They were worried that Moses would become like Jesus. They were worried that Jews would worship Moses and that he would be like a demigod, like some intermediary between God and people. That's why his grave is unmarked. Judaism is built ultimately after the rise of Christianity, I think, in the rabbinic period. It's built on the fear that Moses will become a divinity. And so aside from the criticism and the suspicion of Moses in the rabbinic tradition, the biblical Moses to me is this extraordinary, brave, and yet humble character. And in the end, the Torah affirms this by saying the one virtue that they mention at his death is that he was the most humble of all men. And that's such a strange quality to say about the man who led the people out of Egypt, who spoke to God face to face, who was a prophet beyond all prophets. And so for me, Moses is by far the most intriguing character. And the one weakness of the Haggadah, the decisive weakness of the Haggadah, is that it doesn't deal with Moses.
Yeah. I think that Moses grows. I use the idea of growing to try to deal with some of the ambiguity and the contradictions in his character. Look,
what does he grow from, and what does he grow to?
Well, there's a simple midrashic piece there. In chapter 3, when he's standing before the burning bush, one of his final complaints is, Lo ish dvarim anochi, which, people interpret as having a speech impediment. I'm not a man of words. But it's much deeper than that. He's a man who says, I have nothing to say. I have retreated from public life. He retreated from public life, hid out in the desert with the Midianites, married, had a job as a shepherd, which is talk about social isolation. I mean, that's social isolation. And he becomes a man who is very happy in his own solitude. I have nothing to say. I'm not a man who has a message for the world. I just like my solitary life. And then you turn 4 books ahead, and the beginning of the last book of the Torah is Ve'ela hadvarim asher diber Moshe el kol adat bnei Yisrael. And these are the words that Moses speaks. Ela hadvarim. Somewhere between Exodus 3 and Deuteronomy 1, Moses becomes ish dvarim. He becomes a man of words. He learns what his life is about. He gains his own inner strength to say, I have a message for my children and my children's children. And in Deuteronomy, he talks for 2 years. It's a lot to say. Man has a lot to say. We're still trying to figure out what he meant. I think that process of a man who begins with not just humility, but with a sort of a real sense of reticence to engage the world. He had one engagement with the world and it turned out badly. So he runs away to the desert and hides with the sheep. And now he comes back to the world and becomes that man. And you see the strength growing in him as he begins to figure out how this works. And I love the scene at the Red Sea. So the people are camped in front of the Red Sea. Pharaoh's coming down the mountain with his armies. The sea is in front of him. And the people began fetching. And boy, I'll tell you, when Jews are in trouble, they become articulate. There's nothing in the Bible more articulate than Israelite fetching. And even though imminent death is coming down the mountain, there's time for a soliloquy. And they say to him, were there not enough graves in Egypt? You brought us out here to die in the desert. Just such a great line. And he says to them, shut up and watch. Just watch. And suddenly he doesn't fall on his face. He doesn't give up. He doesn't shrink back. He faces them down and says, just watch. And then, of course, the beautiful next thing is that the next line is God speaks to him. So in between there's an implied verse where Moses turns around to God and says, okay, what do I do? And God says, tell him to move forward. Don't pray. Tell him to move forward. He comes into himself at that moment. It's his liberation, not just the people's liberation. And he begins to figure out why he's in the world and what he's there to say. I find him wonderful in that sense because I find him very human in that sense.
Yeah, but that's also another example of the rabbinic prejudice against the anti-Mosaic prejudice of the rabbis.
Yeah.
Which is the midrash of Nachshon ben Aminadab.
Right.
Here, at the moment when Moses, I think you're totally right, comes into his own as the supreme leader of the people. And this is the supreme miracle because actually all the plagues were about plagues on Egypt. This was the first miracle for Jews that actually was a miracle for the Jewish people, the splitting of the sea. And the rabbis say, no, it wasn't really Moses who split the sea. It was this guy, Nachshon, the son of Aminadab, who walked into the sea and forced God to split the sea because otherwise Nachshon would drown. And that's another prejudice against Moses. So to me, and that, you know how much I love Maimonides, who actually, we should lift up the Maimuna, the Maimonides holiday right at the end of Pesach, the death of Maimonides, and which is always celebrated by Sephardic Jews. But for Maimonides, it was Moses. It was Moses, always Moses. And for me, it is as well. And the reason is that this, and it explains the change which you beautifully described. Moses as a man had nothing to say, but Moses in contact with God became the channeler of God's words into the world. All of a sudden, I mean, he was God's vector, just like Beethoven was. I mean, he was nothing. He was a disabled man, and then all of a sudden, this genius music came flowing out of him. And I think the same is true for Moses. He became a spiritual genius. He was like the Buddha. You know, he was like Allah, like Muhammad. He was a leader who was infused with God to such a degree that there was very little difference. There was true devekut, true gluing between Moses and God.
So this is your theory of prophecy.
Yeah, it's Maimonides' theory.
Well, your theory of prophecy is that there are these people,
yeah,
who become vessels of divinity in the world.
Yeah, pneumatikoi.
And sometimes, as you indicated with Beethoven, you would say that sometimes they are in many ways very broken, flawed people, but they have this particular sensitivity which marks them as unique. And that sensitivity allows them, in Beethoven or Mozart's case, to hear the music of the spheres. In Moses's case, to sense the morality of God.
Yeah, well, for I would say it more in a philosophical way. For the philosopher, 19th century German philosopher, idealist philosopher Hegel, he called them Weltgeschicht Individuum, world historical individuals. He saw it as Napoleon, who rode through his hometown of Jena. But these are people who, pursuing their own life, actually have another mission that they're unaware of, and that is they move human freedom and truth to a higher level than existed before their life's mission. And you can see it. You can see it in Moses. You can see it in Washington and Jefferson. You can see it in Gandhi. You can see it in certain individuals who things are just not the same after them. They're just not the same because a truth has been uttered that cannot be taken back. And that truth is that freedom, in the case of Moses, it is that all people are holy and that freedom is a gift from God. And it's not a gift from the state. Pharaoh can't give you freedom. Pharaoh can't take away your freedom because it is given by God. The state has nothing to do with the freedom that God bestows upon each and every created human being.
So let's now turn to the most intriguing character, who is the character of God. We talked a little bit about the moral issue of hardening Pharaoh's heart and what God is out to do in this moment of history. So what is, and to the extent that you can talk about God's motivations as a literary character here, what motivates God? What is God out to accomplish in this narrative, in this drama? Or what are we celebrating, rather, in the Haggadah when we tell the story to our children?
Well, I think God is trying to make the people free, but that is the ultimate problem of the Exodus, that the only two characters who are attending to the task of freeing the Jewish people from slavery are two characters who never experienced slavery themselves: God and Moses. The only Jew who was never a slave, and of course, God who isn't even a person. So that's the contradiction of the story. Two people who have no idea what slavery does to you, and that are trying to free people from it. And to me, that's the link, Ed. That's the link between the Seder and us. That right now God's trying to do the same thing for you and for me, but God doesn't understand why we're afraid. I love the teaching of the Rabbi that when we die, the first thing that happens to our soul is we're brought to a place where we sort of debrief our life. And the main question we're asked is, why were you afraid of this? Why were you afraid of that? And that's what we are told and help. That's what we finally understand after we die. And either then we're recycled if the Mekubalim are right and we try it again, or that was our one chance. But to me, this is the contradiction of Judaism and the hope of Judaism, that we have a God who knows what freedom is. We have Moses who knew as much as a person could know about freedom, but the rest of us are all slaves. And we're broken, and we're fearful, and we kvetch too much, and we don't see the big picture. And even when God wants to talk to us, we'd rather not hear it. To me, this is the irreducible contradiction and hope of religion, that we worship a God whom we cannot understand, whose name we cannot utter, and whose will we cannot know. But yet, we know enough about that will and that nature and that name. We know enough to love that God and to try to reduce our fear in the knowledge that that God, however great and beyond us, is still our shepherd and who is with us even in the valley of the shadow of death, which this year has special meaning.
Yeah. That was beautiful. Thank you. That's wonderful. I would just emphasize one piece of what you said. We talked about this last week. I think it's the birth of hope. I think this story is a pageant. It's a play. And that's what the Seder is, after all, a pageant with props and a script and a stage. And the answer, the upshot, rather, the message of this play is there's hope for you. History is not simply a tale of a fool. It's not simply a rambling one damn thing after another. History actually does have a teleology. It has a process, and that process yields hope if you can see it, if you can see that big picture. And the moment that's decisive for me is the moment at the other side of the Red Sea, because water in the Bible represents chaos. At the beginning of the cosmos, God divides the water, and at the end, the water is split and history is born. Water means chaos. Water means the triumph of might over right. Water is the cruelty that destroys human beings in their lives. And out of that water comes the birth of hope, and a birth that history might end up at a place of redemption, and that you might be there to watch it. And that, to me, is what this is really, the whole thing is about. Well, last week we finished with your midrash, beautiful midrash on the four sons. Let's finish today again with another midrash on a four. So what's this week's midrashic question, Marc?
Okay, this Gellman question that no one thinks about, but everyone should have thought about. And when Gellman mentions it, everyone says, yeah, why wasn't I thinking about it? That's the category that we're in here. Okay? Here's the question. Why are the four questions never answered? All right? We got four sons who were in the wrong order. That was last week's midrash. But this week we got Manishtana. We got Manishtana. And the Manishtana is the story of are the 4 questions that the youngest child asks. So let's look at the 4 questions and look at how the Haggadah doesn't answer them. First of all, on all other nights we eat bread or matzah. On this night only matzah. Well, first of all, on the night of Passover, we eat only matzah, but nothing in the Haggadah tells us why only matzah. It says we eat matzah, and it tells us about why there wasn't enough time for the bread to rise, but not why only that. Why only that? On other nights, we eat all kinds of herbs. On this night, we eat bitter herbs. Well, first of all, we eat all sorts of herbs in the Seder meal, not just bitter herbs. And why bitter herbs? Why do we have to eat bitter herbs at all? And so that isn't answered. We presume it's the suffering of slavery, but is there another reason? On all other nights we dip herbs, not at all, but this night we dip twice. What kind of question is that? Who cares? And what are the 2 dippings? One is karpas and salt water, the parsley and salt water, and the other is the charoset and the matzah, I guess. But it isn't explained. Nothing in the Seder explains that we're dipping twice. On all other nights we eat in an ordinary manner. On this night we dine misubin, leaning on one side. Now we assume that's because that's how wealthy Romans ate. But it isn't said in the Haggadah that that's how wealthy Romans ate. These are 4 questions that are never answered. So I ask you, my dear friend and teacher, what are the real answers to the 4 questions? Why only matzah? Why bitter herbs? Why 2 dippings? And why do we recline?
Well, I'll make it harder for you, actually.
No, that's hard enough.
Notice something about each of the 4 questions, about the subject about each. The subject of each question is paradoxical. Matzah at the beginning of the Seder is halach ma'anya de'achlu avatana da'ara de Mitzrayim. This is the flat, tasteless bread of oppression, the bread that slaves eat in Egypt. And at the end of the Seder, matzah is the bread we ate because we didn't have time to let the bread rise. We were so anxious to get the hell out of Egypt. We were running out. It's the bread of redemption. Maror, the bitterness is supposed to taste. You're supposed to taste the bitterness of slavery. But when you finally eat it at the Seder, you dip it into charoset, which makes it sweet. It becomes bitterness and sweetness. The dipping, what does dipping mean? It means you're taking one food and putting it into another food. You're changing the taste of something so that it becomes a mixture. And the misubin, the leaning back, well, that actually is a later question, but the first question, the original question in the Mishnah was why we only eat roast meat tonight. And that's the Paschal lamb.
Right.
And the misubin.
We don't eat lamb anymore.
Which we don't eat. Since the 11th century, we gave up lamb.
Right.
Maimonides didn't want us to get too excited about the rebuilding of the temple, and the doctors didn't want us to have too much cholesterol.
And there's the Christian thing. Jesus is the Lamb of God.
The Lamb of God. But the leaning is a sign of redemption, but you're at a meal commemorating your last night in Pesach, in Egypt. The meal is a fundamentally sad moment because it's the last night we're still slaves, and yet we're leaning as if we were wealthy people. Okay, so each of these things is a mixture. It's a paradox.
It's harder. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
People who are tuning in feel, hey, I didn't tune in to get questions that are too hard. I got tuned in to get some answers here.
Well, the answer is that each one of them becomes a sign of your redemption. That's why.
Right.
That matzah moves from the bread of slaves to the bread of redemption. That maror moves from the bitterness of slavery to the sweetness of freedom. That dipping means you drown out the flavor. You don't lose the flavor. You don't lose the memory of your oppression. You don't lose the memory of the pain of being a slave, but you mellow it with the experience of liberation. And all of us who ever had Holocaust survivors at our tables know what that means. The survivor cries through the Seder. My uncle cried through the Seder because he remembered the 6 years he spent as a slave to the Nazis and how he spent years in Auschwitz. But here he sat among his children and his grandchildren as a survivor. That's the mixture of Haroset and Maror. And finally, I lean back because, yeah, I'm still carry the memory, the part of me which was a slave. But tonight I see a dream for something for my kids. We'll have a world of tomorrow. I think each of these is a beautiful symbol of the redemption that we celebrate on Pesach. My dear teacher and friend, I will see you next Shabbos, God willing. I wish all of our friends at home a good Shabbos and stay well and stay healthy. A last word, Rabbi?
No. My last word is thank you for doing this, and it is such a joy to teach with you. There is something bigger than each of us that comes out of this, and it is a real joy to see it. Appreciate it. Stay well, and to all of our friends, stay well, stay healthy, stay together, don't lose each other. And if you need to talk to a rabbi, you can call me at Valley Beth Shalom, and I'll let you talk to Gellman for a few minutes as well. Yeah, if you need a rabbi, call me. I'll give you Eddie's number. Take care. Be well. God bless.